On August 14, 2024, at 2:43 in the afternoon, Tyler Brennan, 39 years old, certified underwater archaeologist with 15 years of Mediterranean research experience, was conducting a survey dive 83 miles southeast of Crete when his ROV detected something that violated every principle of structural engineering he understood. At 670 feet below surface, well beyond recreational diving limits, the sonar revealed a humanoid statue 18 feet tall, weighing an estimated 47 tons, balanced on a deteriorating rock formation that should have collapsed centuries ago. The statue wasn't leaning. It wasn't supported by any visible structure. It simply stood there, defying gravity and geology. 2 hours and 11 minutes later, Greek Coast Guard vessels surrounded his research boat, arriving from Athens in a time frame that should have been impossible. Tyler had never transmitted the coordinates to anyone. His radio had been silent since the descent. So how did they know exactly where to find him? Tyler Brennan wasn't the kind of person who imagined things underwater. 15 years of experience had taught him to trust his instruments and doubt his instincts when nitrogen narcosis could turn shadows into monsters. He'd served 6 years as a Navy diver before transitioning to academic research, working on the Titanic recovery operations back in 2010 when a rookie mistake could mean death at those depths. Now he taught Mediterranean maritime history as an adjunct professor at UC San Diego, specializing in the civilizations that mainstream archaeology preferred to ignore, the ones that didn't fit neatly into established timelines. His colleagues called his theories ambitious. His department chair called them career suicide. Tyler called them honest. He was a divorced father trying to balance tenure-track pressure with custody weekends, and his 12-year-old daughter Lily was the only person who still believed his work mattered. Before he'd left for Crete 3 weeks ago, she'd made him promise to find something incredible this summer, something that would make the other kids at school stop asking why her dad studied old rocks instead of getting a real job. He'd laughed and told her he'd do his best. Now, ascending slowly from 670 feet with his decompression computer flashing yellow warnings and his right glove partially melted from touching something that shouldn't exist, Tyler realized he might have actually kept that promise. The expedition had been funded by a private collector who preferred to remain anonymous, a common arrangement in underwater archaeology, where the line between research and treasure hunting blurred depending on who was writing the check. The contract was simple: map previously unexplored sections of submerged Greek ruins southeast of Crete, document any artifacts of historical significance, and provide detailed photographic evidence for the benefactor's private collection. Nothing would be removed from the site. Everything would remain untouched. Tyler had worked under these conditions before, and the $45,000 payment had covered his daughter's tuition at a private school where kids didn't have to explain why their father wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. His team was small by necessity and budget. Brett Kowalski handled sonar equipment and technical logistics, a former commercial diver who'd worked Gulf of Mexico oil rigs before the industry collapsed, and he'd moved into research. Zoe Park operated the cameras and ROV systems, a documentary filmmaker who'd shot underwater footage for National Geographic and knew how to capture images that made scientific grants materialize. They'd been working together for 3 years, and Tyler trusted them with his life at depths where a single equipment failure meant you didn't come home. The location was 83 miles southeast of Crete, in waters that averaged 670 feet deep, right at the edge of technical diving limits, where every breath required careful planning and every minute underwater demanded 3 minutes of decompression on the way up. The area had been marked as archaeologically significant since the 1970s, but bureaucratic red tape and territorial disputes between Greek authorities and international research organizations had kept serious exploration to a minimum. In fact, the entire zone had been listed as off-limits to civilian diving until 2018, and no official explanation had ever been provided for why the restrictions were suddenly lifted. They'd been surveying a ridge formation for 6 hours when Brett's sonar screen lit up with something that made him call Tyler over to look. The acoustic signature showed a geometric anomaly, too regular to be natural rock formation, too massive to be modern debris. Tyler suited up in his technical diving gear, checked his trimix gas mixture, triple-checked his decompression tables, and descended with 2 high-definition cameras mounted on his helmet. The water was exceptionally clear that day, visibility extending almost 80 feet in the afternoon light that penetrated down from the surface in pale blue columns. He saw it at 420 feet. At first, Tyler thought his eyes were playing tricks, nitrogen narcosis starting early despite the precise gas mix. But as he descended closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. A humanoid figure, 18 feet tall, carved from dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The statue was partially buried in sediment, but enough was visible to reveal facial features that made Tyler's breath catch in his regulator. The proportions were wrong. Not grotesquely wrong, not obviously alien, just subtly off in ways that his archaeologist's eye immediately recognized. The eyes were 23% larger than human anatomy would allow. The cranium was elongated, not dramatically, but noticeably, swept back in a way that suggested intelligence and predation in equal measure. The base of the statue was covered in symbols that Tyler couldn't identify, and he'd spent 15 years studying 12 different ancient writing systems. These weren't Greek. They weren't Egyptian, Phoenician, Linear A, Linear B, or any cuneiform variant he'd ever encountered. The characters seemed to flow and interconnect in patterns that suggested linguistic sophistication, but the actual shapes refused to resolve into anything familiar. Tyler photographed everything, his camera flashing in the dim water as he documented the discovery from every angle. Then he checked his dive computer and saw something impossible. The water temperature at this depth should have been a consistent 41 degrees Fahrenheit. His external thermometer confirmed that reading everywhere except within 10 feet of the statue. There, the temperature spiked to 68 degrees, a 27-degree differential that violated every principle of thermodynamics he understood. Heat didn't spontaneously generate in freezing water at 670 feet. There was no thermal vent, no volcanic activity, no explanation. Tyler reached out to touch the statue's base, needing physical confirmation that this was real. The moment his neoprene glove made contact, he felt searing heat pulse through the material. He jerked his hand back and watched in horror as the outer layer of his glove began to melt, the synthetic rubber liquefying and peeling away from his palm. His skin underneath was bright red, first-degree burns forming in real time. He'd just touched something that was radiating enough heat to damage industrial-grade diving equipment while surrounded by water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. That wasn't just improbable. That was physically impossible. Tyler's training took over. He signaled ascent to Brett through the underwater communication system, began his slow climb back to the surface, and spent the next 3 hours hanging at various depths, while his body off-gassed nitrogen and helium. His mind raced through possibilities, discarding each one as he mentally reviewed the footage his helmet camera had captured. By the time he reached the surface at 3:47 in the afternoon, his right hand throbbing with pain and his glove hanging in melted strips, Tyler knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, he'd discovered something that would rewrite Mediterranean archaeology. Second, Whatever that statue was made of, it wasn't any material currently known to science. And third, the Greek Coast Guard vessels that appeared on the horizon 17 minutes after he surfaced had been waiting for him to find exactly what he'd found. Brett was waiting on deck when Tyler emerged, and the first thing he said wasn't about the discovery. He asked about the glove. Zoe appeared seconds later with the first aid kit, and while she cleaned and bandaged the burns on Tyler's right palm, Brett pulled him aside and admitted something he'd been keeping quiet. 40 minutes before Tyler surfaced, the sonar had detected an unusual magnetic signature emanating from the exact coordinates where the statue rested. Brett hadn't mentioned it during the dive because he'd assumed it was equipment malfunction. But now, seeing the melted glove and the thermal readings that made no sense, he wasn't so sure. Zoe pulled up the footage from Tyler's helmet camera, and they watched it together on her laptop screen. And that's when they noticed the visual distortion. Every time the camera focused directly on the statue's face, the image seemed to glitch, pixels fragmenting and reassembling in ways that suggested the camera's processing software was struggling to interpret what it was recording. It wasn't corruption of the video file, it was happening in real time during the dive, as if the camera itself couldn't properly render whatever material the statue was made from. Tyler immediately downloaded everything to his personal laptop. Coordinates from the GPS, photos from his helmet cameras, data logs from his dive computer, sonar readings, thermal scans, every piece of digital evidence that proved what he'd found. He'd been in this field long enough to know that discoveries like this had a way of disappearing into bureaucratic black holes, especially when they challenged accepted historical narratives. He backed everything up to an SD card and slipped it into the inner pocket of his wetsuit, the one place nobody would think to check. 15 minutes later, at 4:15 in the afternoon, a Greek research vessel appeared on the horizon, moving at a speed that suggested they'd been underway long before Tyler had surfaced. Brett checked their position on the navigation system and confirmed what Tyler already suspected. They were in international waters, 0.8 miles beyond the Greek territorial limit. Whatever authority the approaching vessel claimed to have, it wasn't based on jurisdiction. The Greek vessel pulled alongside at 4:32, and the man who came aboard introduced himself as Commander Andreas. He was polite, almost apologetic, but his eyes were cold, and his body language communicated that politeness was a courtesy that could be withdrawn at any moment. He explained that Tyler's team was being detained for unauthorized archaeological excavation in protected waters. Tyler argued the facts. They were in international waters. They hadn't excavated anything. They'd photographed a geological feature, which was explicitly permitted under the terms of their research visa. Commander Andreas listened patiently, nodded at appropriate moments, and then completely ignored everything Tyler had said. He requested all cameras, computers, sonar equipment, and dive logs. The word requested was interesting, because the 6 armed men who'd accompanied him onto the deck made it clear that compliance wasn't optional. Zoe protested, explaining that her cameras contained footage for a documentary she'd been filming for 8 months, material that had nothing to do with today's dive. Commander Andreas sympathized. He truly did. But regulations were regulations, and everything would be returned after a thorough review. Tyler handed over his laptop, his helmet cameras, his GoPro backup units, everything except the SD card hidden in his wetsuit pocket. The guards removed the entire ROV from its mounting cradle, disconnecting cables with practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Then Commander Andreas asked a question that made Tyler's blood go cold. He asked about thermal readings, specifically whether Tyler had noticed any temperature anomalies during the dive. Tyler hadn't mentioned temperature. His dive report had focused on the statue's physical characteristics and the unknown writing system. There was no way Commander Andreas should have known about the thermal differential unless someone had been monitoring Tyler's equipment in real time, reading telemetry that was supposed to be encrypted on a private commercial frequency. Tyler played it cautious. He mentioned that his dive computer had shown some fluctuating readings, but he'd attributed it to sensor malfunction at depth. Commander Andreas smiled, said that made sense, and then issued their official instructions. They had 2 hours to leave the area. They were prohibited from returning within a 20-mile radius of these coordinates. Their research visas would be reviewed, and any future applications for diving permits in Greek waters would be subject to enhanced scrutiny. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic precision, wrapped in the language of regulatory compliance, but Tyler heard it clearly. Come back, and your careers are over. Tell anyone what you found, and there will be consequences. They sailed back to Chania on the north coast of Crete in silence, each of them processing what had just happened. Tyler's hand throbbed where the burns were starting to blister despite Zoe's careful bandaging. They docked at 9:23 that night and checked into a small hotel near the old Venetian harbor. While Brett and Zoe went to dinner, Tyler stayed in his room and pulled out the SD card he'd hidden. 847 photos, all high-resolution, documenting the statue from every conceivable angle. The symbols on the base were clearly visible. The facial proportions were undeniable. The evidence was irrefutable. He uploaded everything to an encrypted cloud server, then emailed copies to himself using 3 different accounts, then saved backups to a USB drive he kept in his wallet. If someone wanted to erase this discovery, they'd have to work for it. Brett knocked on his door at 11:40 and came in holding his laptop. He'd been researching the Greek vessel that had intercepted them, running the hull number through maritime registration databases. The ship didn't exist, not in any official capacity. The hull number belonged to a patrol boat that had been decommissioned and scrapped in 2019. Whoever had detained them was operating with falsified credentials, which raised uncomfortable questions about whether Commander Andreas actually represented the Greek government or something else entirely. Zoe joined them an hour later with her own discovery. She'd reached out to a contact who worked with Google Earth's satellite imaging team, asking casually about coverage of the Mediterranean. The area where they'd found the statue had been digitally blurred in all satellite imagery since March of 2019. Not restricted, not marked as classified, just quietly made invisible to anyone searching from above. Tyler decided to reach out to colleagues who specialized in ancient linguistics, people who might be able to identify the writing system he'd photographed. He sent images of the symbols to 3 academics he'd known for years. Dr. Rachel Kim at Stanford, who'd written the definitive text on Minoan scripts, Professor Omar Hassan at Oxford, whose work on Phoenician trade routes had won him international recognition, Dr. Nina Volkov at the Moscow Institute of Archaeology, who'd published extensively on pre-Indo-European languages. Rachel never responded. Omar's email bounced back with a delivery failure message, which was strange because Tyler had corresponded with him just 2 months earlier. Nina replied within 6 hours, but her message consisted of 4 words. Stop. Don't ask again. Please. Tyler pulled up the contract he'd signed with the anonymous collector who'd funded the expedition. The payment had come from a limited liability company registered in Delaware, which wasn't unusual for private collectors who valued discretion. What was unusual was that when Brett ran a corporate search, he discovered the LLC had been officially dissolved 48 hours before their expedition had even begun. Someone had paid them $45,000 to find something specific, then deleted every trace of the transaction before Tyler had descended to 670 feet. The question wasn't whether they'd been set up. The question was why, and by whom, and what they'd actually found that was worth this level of coordinated deception. Tyler spent the next 2 weeks researching from his hotel room in Chania, diving deep into archaeological forums, academic databases, and the darker corners of the internet where researchers shared discoveries that hadn't made it through peer review. He was looking for patterns, for any indication that someone else had found something similar and been silenced the same way. What he discovered was worse than he'd imagined. There were 4 documented incidents spread across the Mediterranean, each one following an eerily familiar trajectory. In 2017, a German diver named Klaus Hoffmann had photographed a statue matching Tyler's description at 520 feet off the coast of Malta. Hoffmann had posted preliminary findings on a marine archaeology forum, complete with underwater photos and coordinates. 3 days later, his posts were deleted, his forum account was suspended, and Klaus Hoffmann himself disappeared. Not died, not moved away. Simply vanished from public record, his social media accounts deleted, his university email address returning failure messages. Cyprus, in 2019. A Turkish research ROV had detected a metallic humanoid structure at 640 feet during what was supposed to be a routine geological survey. The footage showed the same elongated cranium, the same impossible proportions Tyler had documented. Within 72 hours, the area was declared a military exclusion zone by both Turkish and Greek naval forces, a rare moment of cooperation between 2 nations that had been in territorial disputes for decades. Sardinia, in 2021. Local fishermen had filmed what they called a giant statue, visible through unusually clear water during a storm. The footage went viral on Italian social media before Carabinieri confiscated every phone and camera that had captured the image. The official explanation was that the fishermen had filmed a submerged Greek cargo ship, despite the fact that the object in the video was clearly upright and humanoid. Tunisia, in 2023. A French archaeologist named Claire Dubois published a peer-reviewed paper titled Metallic Sculptures of Unknown Origin in Mediterranean Deep Waters. The paper was retracted within 48 hours, with the journal claiming data fabrication despite Dubois providing extensive photographic evidence. She was terminated from her position at the University of Marseille and hasn't published anything since. Tyler plotted all 5 locations on a map, including his own discovery off Crete. The pattern was undeniable. Every statue was located in the central Mediterranean at depths between 500 and 700 feet, spaced roughly 200 to 300 miles apart. When he connected the coordinates with lines, they formed a nearly perfect pentagon. Tyler sat back and stared at the geometric shape on his screen, his archaeologist's mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Ancient cultures had been obsessed with geometric precision, but this level of planning across such vast distances suggested coordination and technology that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. He calculated the center point of the pentagon, 34 degrees 12 minutes north, 18 degrees 45 minutes east. Open Mediterranean water, no islands, no known archaeological sites. He checked the depth at those coordinates, 2,400 feet. Whatever was down there, it was beyond the range of any equipment Tyler had access to. Tyler returned to San Diego 2 weeks later, exhausted and paranoid, and carrying evidence that nobody seemed to want him to have. He'd expected to walk back into his office at UC San Diego and resume teaching, to process the discovery through proper academic channels, to do everything by the book. Instead, He found a memo from the department chair placing him on administrative leave pending review of unspecified concerns about his recent fieldwork. No details were provided. No timeline was given. Just an instruction to clear his office and remain available for potential interviews with the university's legal department. His teaching assignments for the fall semester had already been redistributed to other faculty. His daughter Lily called that night, the way she did every Tuesday and Thursday as part of the custody arrangement. She asked if Daddy was in trouble because Mommy had said something about work problems. Tyler lied smoothly, told her it was just boring paperwork issues, nothing to worry about, and changed the subject to her soccer practice. After they hung up, he sat in his empty apartment and wondered how far the reach of whoever was suppressing this discovery actually extended. University administration moving that quickly suggested pressure from outside, the kind of pressure that came with funding threats or government inquiries. Brett had tried calling 4 times in the last 72 hours. Every call went straight to voicemail without ringing, as if Brett's number had been blocked at the carrier level. Tyler drove to Brett's apartment in Pacific Beach and found it empty. Not just vacant, but cleaned out, as if no one had ever lived there. He checked with the building manager, who explained that Brett had terminated his lease early through mutual agreement. No forwarding address, no explanation. Just gone. Zoe sent a single text message from an encrypted messaging app at 3 a.m. They visited me. Knew about SD card. Don't contact me again. Sorry. Tyler replied immediately, asking who had visited her and what they'd said. The message showed as delivered, but never read. Zoe's phone number was disconnected by morning. That's when Tyler noticed the sedan. Black, generic, the kind of car that rental companies and government agencies preferred because it was completely forgettable. It appeared parked on his street on a Wednesday, 50 yards from his apartment building. Different car on Thursday. Same make and model. Same dark-tinted windows. Positioned 40 yards away in a different spot. Friday brought a third vehicle. This one, a dark blue SUV, parked with a clear sight line to his front door. The license plates were different each day, registered to different rental companies in different cities. Tyler wasn't being followed. He was being watched. There was a difference. Following meant they wanted to know where you were going. Watching meant they wanted you to know they were there. Tyler made the decision on a Sunday morning while his daughter was still asleep after a custody weekend. He was going to go public. Not through academic channels, which had already proven compromised. Not through official media, which would demand corroboration he couldn't provide without putting sources at risk. He would go through an investigative journalist, someone with a track record of protecting sources and publishing stories that made powerful people uncomfortable. He reached out to Chase Morrison, a reporter with the Los Angeles Times who'd spent the last decade covering military secrecy and government surveillance programs. Chase's work on unauthorized CIA operations in the Mediterranean had won him awards and made him enough enemies to prove he couldn't be easily intimidated. They spoke on an encrypted call. Tyler explained what he'd found, offered to provide photographic evidence, and made it clear that people were already being disappeared for knowing too much. Chase listened without interrupting, then asked the kind of questions that proved he was taking this seriously. How many independent sources could verify the discovery? What was the chain of custody for the photographic evidence? Were there any academic institutions willing to go on record? Tyler answered honestly. The sources were compromised or missing. The chain of custody was just him. No institutions would touch this. Chase was quiet for a long moment, then said he'd need to verify everything independently, cross-reference with his own contacts, but if the evidence was as solid as Tyler claimed, they could move forward. They scheduled a meeting for 3 days later. Chase's office, noon. Tyler spent those 3 days making redundant backups of every file, every photo, every piece of evidence he'd collected. He uploaded encrypted copies to cloud servers in 6 different countries. He saved duplicates to USB drives he mailed to himself at 3 different addresses. He created draft emails containing the full archive and saved them in account drafts that could be accessed from anywhere. If something happened to him, the information would still exist, scattered across enough digital locations that it couldn't all be erased simultaneously. The call came at 11:47 on Tuesday night, less than 12 hours before his scheduled meeting with Chase Morrison. The number showed as originating from Greece, but the voice on the other end spoke English with a flat American accent, the kind that came from years of training to sound like you were from nowhere specific. The message was brief. "Don't meet with Morrison. This isn't a threat. It's advice. You have a daughter." The line went dead before Tyler could respond. He checked Lily's location on the family tracking app they used for custody logistics. She was at her mother's house, exactly where she should be. Safe. For now. Tyler sat in his living room until dawn, staring at his phone, weighing his options. He could meet with Chase anyway, go public with everything, and hope that exposure would provide protection. Or he could accept that whoever was behind this was willing to threaten a 12-year-old girl to keep their secrets buried. By the time the sun rose, Tyler had made his choice. He just wasn't sure it was the right one. Tyler went to meet Chase Morrison anyway. He dropped Lily off at school Wednesday morning, hugged her a little longer than usual, and told her he loved her. Then he drove to downtown Los Angeles, parked 3 blocks from the LA Times building, and walked the rest of the way while checking over his shoulder for surveillance he knew was there but couldn't quite spot. Chase's office was on the 14th floor, tucked between the investigative unit and the editorial department. Tyler arrived at 11:58, 2 minutes early. The office was empty. Not just Chase isn't here yet empty, but cleared out empty. The kind of empty that happens when someone leaves a job suddenly and their belongings are packed up by security. Tyler checked the nameplate on the door. It still said Chase Morrison, but there was a printed notice taped below it. On assignment. Inquiries to editorial. Tyler tried calling Chase's cell phone. It went straight to a disconnected number message. He walked back to his car in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. Chase had either been warned off, been reassigned to keep him away from Tyler's story, or worse. Tyler sat in his car for 20 minutes, debating his next move, when his phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was a temporary email address, the kind that self-destructs after 24 hours. The subject line was empty. The message contained 2 sentences. "A friend who knows what you found. Open the attachment somewhere secure." Tyler waited until he was home, disconnected his laptop from the internet, and opened the file on an isolated system. It was a compressed folder containing 43 pages of scanned documents, marked with classification stamps and NATO designations. The cover page said, "Project Elder, Mediterranean Deep Survey Initiative, Eyes Only, Cosmic Top Secret." Tyler's hands were shaking as he scrolled through the files. Project Elder was a joint NATO operation that had been running continuously since 1974, coordinated between American, Greek, Italian, French, and Turkish naval intelligence. The mission parameters were straightforward. Locate, document, and suppress public knowledge of 19 anomalous structures in the Mediterranean Sea. Not 5 structures. 19. The first discovery had been made in 1967 by Greek military divers during the military junta period. They'd found a statue matching Tyler's description at 490 feet off the coast of Rhodes. The Greek government had kept it classified until NATO pressure forced them to share the discovery with Allied intelligence services in the early 70s. The documents included material analysis reports that made Tyler's archaeology background feel suddenly inadequate. The statue material wasn't stone. It wasn't any known metal. Spectroscopic analysis showed an isotopic composition that didn't match any naturally occurring elements on Earth. The ratios were wrong, the decay patterns were impossible, and multiple independent laboratories had confirmed the results before the samples were locked away in classified storage. Radiocarbon dating had been attempted and failed. Thermoluminescence dating gave readings that the report described as temporally negative, which Tyler understood to mean the tests suggested the material was somehow older than the testing method could measure. One memo, marked urgent and dated October 1979, stated simply, "Objects predate Holocene epoch. Implications require immediate policy review." The Holocene epoch began 11,700 years ago, marking the end of the last ice age and the beginning of human civilization as archaeologists understood it. There were no human cultures capable of metalworking or monumental sculpture 12,000 years ago. There were barely humans capable of agriculture. The idea that someone or something had created these statues before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before even the earliest Mesopotamian cities was academically insane. But the NATO documents treated it as established fact, a problem to be managed rather than a mystery to be solved. Tyler found the comprehensive map buried in the middle of the document cache. All 19 confirmed statue locations plotted with military precision across the Mediterranean basin. The pattern he'd identified with 5 locations was just a fragment of something far more complex. The statues weren't arranged in a simple pentagon. They formed a 3-dimensional geometric network, a structure that only made sense if you considered the varying depths as intentional coordinates in a spatial grid. Tyler pulled out graph paper and started plotting points, translating the 2-dimensional map into a 3-dimensional model using depth as the z-axis. What emerged was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. The statues formed a perfect dodecahedron, a 12-sided solid where each face was a regular pentagon. But the geometry didn't exist solely underwater. When Tyler extended the mathematical model upward, projecting the structure through sea level and into the atmosphere, the pattern pointed to a specific location in space, 67,000 feet above the central Mediterranean, directly above the coordinates he'd calculated earlier. That altitude wasn't arbitrary. It corresponded to the lower boundary of space, the edge where Earth's atmosphere transitioned into the vacuum beyond. Tyler cross-referenced orbital mechanics databases looking for satellites or space debris at that exact location. There was nothing. No active satellites. No defunct hardware. Just empty space, according to official records. But Tyler had learned not to trust official records. He dug deeper, searching through declassified launch manifests and military space program histories. Between 1974 and 1989, NATO had conducted 7 classified satellite launches described only as reconnaissance payloads, with no published orbital parameters. The launch dates corresponded with major Project Elder milestones, moments when new statues were discovered or when unusual activity was detected. Tyler plotted the most likely orbital trajectory for a surveillance satellite tasked with monitoring the Mediterranean. The math put it at 67,000 feet, in a position that would allow constant observation of all 19 statue locations simultaneously. Then he noticed something else in the geometric pattern. The dodecahedron wasn't oriented to Earth's current magnetic north. It was rotated by 23.4 degrees, aligned instead to astronomical north. More specifically, aligned to the position of the constellation Orion, as it would have appeared 12,800 years ago, accounting for the precession of the equinoxes. This was knowledge that human civilization didn't possess until Greek astronomers figured it out around 500 BC. Whoever had built these statues understood celestial mechanics, understood that Earth's rotational axis wobbled in a 26,000-year cycle, and had encoded that knowledge into their construction placement. They'd built a star map, using the Mediterranean seafloor as their canvas and statues as their markers. The final section of the documents was labeled Activation Events, Requires Immediate Notification. Tyler read through incident reports spanning 7 decades, each one describing moments when the statues had demonstrated they were more than inert monuments. In 1954, a NATO destroyer had detected a powerful electromagnetic pulse emanating from a statue off the coast of Crete, occurring simultaneously with a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. The pulse had been strong enough to temporarily disable the ship's radio equipment and cause compass needles to spin wildly for 47 minutes. 1987. Soviet submarines monitoring a statue near Cyprus reported that the structure had begun glowing during a total solar eclipse, emitting light in a spectrum that their instruments identified as coherent, almost laser-like in its properties. The glow had lasted for the entire duration of totality, then ceased the moment the eclipse ended. 2011. During the magnitude 7.1 earthquake that struck Turkey, 4 separate statues had activated simultaneously, each one broadcasting what signal analysis described as coordinated pulses in mathematical sequence. The pattern had repeated every 17 minutes for 6 hours, then stopped as abruptly as it began. The NATO analysis concluded that the statues were part of a beacon network, markers intended to signal something. But signal what? And to whom? The documents included competing theories from various intelligence agencies. The Americans believed they were archaeological markers left by an unknown predecessor civilization. The French thought they might be naturally occurring formations with unusual electromagnetic properties. The Russians, according to leaked memos, believed they were actively monitoring something and had proposed that the network was still operational, still serving whatever purpose it had been designed for 12 millennia ago. Tyler found a risk assessment report dated March 2024, just 5 months before his own discovery. Seismic activity along the fault line between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates had increased by 400% above historical norms in the preceding 6 months. The report's conclusion was clinically direct. If a major earthquake struck the Mediterranean, magnitude 8.0 or higher, there was a high probability that all 19 statues would activate simultaneously. Nobody knew what would happen when that occurred, but the historical precedents suggested it would involve massive electromagnetic disruption across the entire Mediterranean basin. Satellite systems would fail, communications would go dark, navigation equipment would become unreliable, and whatever message the statues were designed to broadcast would finally be sent, transmitted into space or into the depths, or into whatever void they'd been pointing toward for 12,000 years. The last page Tyler read was a simple chart showing earthquake probabilities over the next 5 years. If current seismic trends continued, the chance of a magnitude 8.0 or larger event occurring in the Mediterranean was 67%. That wasn't a distant theoretical risk. That was a coin flip, weighted slightly toward disaster, and the timer was already running. Tyler made a decision that felt like surrender, but might have been survival. He wouldn't publish the photos. He wouldn't go public with the documents. His daughter's safety mattered more than rewriting history, more than scientific recognition, more than any principle he'd built his career around. But he also couldn't pretend he'd never seen what he'd seen, couldn't erase the knowledge that humanity's timeline was wrong and something ancient was still active beneath the Mediterranean. So he took a middle path. He anonymously uploaded the classified documents to 12 different journalists, 3 WikiLeaks-style transparency organizations, and 4 academic institutions known for publishing controversial research. He sent everything from internet cafes and public libraries, bouncing the data through encryption networks that made tracing the source nearly impossible. Then he waited to see if anyone would be brave enough or foolish enough to publish. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. No news articles. No academic papers. No leaked documents appearing on transparency websites. It was as if the information had been sent into a void and simply disappeared. Tyler returned to his teaching position at UC San Diego after the university quietly lifted his administrative leave without explanation or apology. Brett reappeared in San Diego 3 months later, working for a marine consulting firm with offices in Washington, D.C. They ran into each other at a conference. Brett's handshake was friendly, but his eyes were warning Tyler not to ask questions, not to mention Greece, not to revisit anything that had happened in the Mediterranean. Zoe had moved to New Zealand and taken a job at an aquarium, filming promotional videos for tourist attractions. She'd deleted all her social media accounts and stopped responding to emails from anyone connected to her previous work. Tyler pulled up Google Earth one night and searched for the coordinates where he'd found the statue. The area that had been blurred in satellite imagery for years was now crystal clear, showing something that made his breath catch. A large floating research platform had been anchored directly above the discovery site, surrounded by military vessels from 4 different nations: Greece, Italy, France, United States. The platform hadn't been there when Tyler made his discovery 6 months earlier. Now it appeared to be a permanent installation with support ships rotating in and out on what looked like a regular schedule. Whatever Project Elder had been doing in secret for 50 years, they were no longer bothering to hide their presence. October 2024 brought a magnitude 6.8 earthquake to southern Turkey, strong enough to cause significant damage and tragic loss of life. Tyler monitored news coverage obsessively, searching for any indication of unusual electromagnetic activity or reports that might suggest the statues had activated. Official news sources reported nothing beyond standard earthquake coverage. But Reddit told a different story. A Turkish naval officer had posted in a military forum about witnessing something inexplicable the night of the earthquake. According to his account, which was deleted 40 minutes after being posted, he'd watched from his ship as more than 30 military vessels from multiple nations sailed to the same coordinates in the central Mediterranean, moving in perfect synchronization as if responding to a coordinated alert. The post included approximate coordinates. Tyler checked them against his map. They corresponded exactly to the geometric center of the dodecahedron pattern, the point 2,400 feet deep where nothing was supposed to exist. December 2024 brought a leaked NOAA report, classified immediately after publication, but not before several researchers had downloaded copies. The document described an unexplained magnetic anomaly detected in the central Mediterranean on the same night as the Turkish earthquake. The anomaly had lasted 47 minutes, generating electromagnetic interference equivalent to a nuclear reactor operating at full capacity. Ships within 50 miles reported compass failures, GPS malfunctions, and radio blackouts. The official explanation blamed solar activity and unusual atmospheric conditions. The unofficial whispers among researchers who'd seen the data suggested something else entirely. Something had activated underwater, broadcast a signal powerful enough to disrupt technology across hundreds of square miles, then gone silent again. Tyler tried accessing the original NOAA document through official channels. The website returned a 404 error, indicating the page had never existed. But the researchers who'd downloaded it confirmed the data was real. The measurements were accurate, and whatever had caused that magnetic pulse was still down there, still waiting, still operational after 12,000 years. Tyler still has the photographs. 847 high-resolution images stored across multiple encrypted locations, documenting a discovery that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge and military intelligence agencies want erased from public consciousness. He still has the coordinates, the exact location where something impossible rests on the Mediterranean seafloor. And he still has the scars, both physical and psychological, from touching something that radiated heat in freezing water and left second-degree burns through industrial diving equipment. The melted glove sits in a safe deposit box, analyzed by a private laboratory that confirmed exposure to temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. The lab technician had asked how Tyler managed to survive contact with something that hot while submerged in 41-degree water. Tyler hadn't had a good answer then. He still doesn't. The burns on his palm healed within 6 weeks, leaving a scar pattern that almost resembles the symbols he'd photographed on the statue's base. He tells himself it's coincidence, pattern recognition run amok. But late at night, when he can't sleep, he traces the lines with his other hand and wonders. Project Elder continues operating with an estimated annual budget of $340 million, a figure Tyler calculated by analyzing leaked NATO defense appropriations and tracking unexplained allocations to Mediterranean naval operations. That's not the budget of an archaeological research program. That's the budget of an active monitoring operation, something that requires constant surveillance, rapid response capabilities, and enough resources to suppress information across multiple nations simultaneously. Lily asked him recently if he'd ever go back to Greece. She's 14 now, old enough to understand that her father's work isn't just about studying old rocks, old enough to sense that something significant happened during that summer expedition 2 years ago. Tyler told her maybe, someday, when she's old enough to come with him. He didn't tell her that he checks seismic monitoring websites every morning, tracking earthquake activity along the Mediterranean fault lines with the obsessive focus of someone waiting for a disaster he knows is coming but can't prevent. 3 months ago, Tyler revisited the geometric calculations, working through the mathematics of the dodecahedron pattern with fresh eyes and better data. That's when he noticed something he'd missed during his initial analysis. The point 67,000 feet above the Mediterranean, the apex of the three-dimensional structure, isn't stationary. It moves. Not randomly, but in a precise pattern that corresponds to a satellite in geostationary orbit. Tyler checked official satellite registries. That orbital position is empty. No active satellites. No space debris, no recorded hardware of any kind. But NATO's classified satellite launches between 1974 and 1989, the ones with no published orbital parameters, they all occurred within months of major Project Elder milestones, launch windows that lined up perfectly with statue discoveries and activation events. 7 launches. 7 payloads with no public mission statements, and not a single one appears in current satellite tracking databases, as if they were launched and then erased from official existence. Tyler can't stop thinking about the implications. The statues form a geometric network that points upward to a specific location in space. An empty location, according to official records. A location that might not be empty at all, if those classified satellites are still operational and have been silently monitoring the Mediterranean for 50 years. The question that keeps him awake isn't whether the statues are beacons. The documents confirmed that much. The question is directionality. Are the statues pointing up toward something in orbit, marking targets or coordinates or landing zones for something that might be listening from above? Or is whatever's in orbit pointing down at them, monitoring ancient technology that predates human civilization and waiting for the moment when seismic activity grows strong enough to trigger a full activation? The seismic data shows no signs of decreasing. If anything, the fault line between Africa and Eurasia is becoming more active, pressure building toward an inevitable release. When that magnitude 8 earthquake finally hits, and all 19 statues activate simultaneously, broadcasting their signal at full power, what happens next depends on which direction those beacons are pointing, and whether anyone, or anything, is still listening after 12,000 years of silence. Tyler hasn't slept well since realizing one final detail. The geometric pattern, the dodecahedron structure, it's not just pointing to a location in space, it's pointing to where that location will be on a specific date. He's calculated the orbital mechanics, accounted for Earth's rotation, and the precession of the equinoxes. And the math gives him a single moment in time when the entire system aligns perfectly. March 17th, 2026. 18 months from now. Either that's when something arrives, or that's when something buried in the Mediterranean for 12 millennia finally wakes up and calls home.